Yay! So happy days. Okay, great. So we are into chapter 10. We're getting near chapter 11, sister.
Hallelujah.
Uh-huh. So, now, chapter 10 is going to take a couple of weeks to get through. We're only going to get through the first couple of things today. So, few verses or first 13 verses today. Maybe do the other half next week. We'll probably not get to chapter 11 until September. So, anyway, if you have any more holidays, take them. I'm taking more holidays. So, anyway.
So, did you actually clear that with us?
No. So, yeah. I suppose, I could be down in Killybegs, driving along, and that's how Ailish used to tune in. Ailish used to tune in and be, he had her phone and she was just driving away and looking. And, So, anyway, so we're doing first part of chapter 10, which is about, as I entitled it, practice and profession. So because you have a lot of people that are professing faith. And as I would say, some people that profess faith don't necessarily possess faith. Okay, there's a lot of professors out there, meaning that people that say, "Oh yes, I'm a Christian," but their behavior then says something completely different. So, so we're going to be looking at practice, how to live out the Christian life. And dealing specifically with temptation, because in this particular chapter, there's a very, very popular verse that deals with temptation. So we'll be sort of throwing the brakes on a bit and looking at that verse quite a lot. So let's, Paul starts off here and talks really about dangers and looks into the Old Testament about certain things. So we'll start here with 1 Corinthians 10, the first 11 verses initially. So it says, "Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all of our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And do not become idolaters as some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents, nor complain as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the end of the ages have come." So Paul's now highlighting some Old Testament examples here. Now this would have been as kind of a foreign thing for the Corinthians, because these are Gentile people, they're pagan people, they're not Jewish people necessarily. There's Jews that were living in Corinth, but a lot of the people that were being reached were not necessarily Jewish people that would have had a Jewish background and an understanding of Jewish history. So it does demonstrate that it's important to have some understanding of Old Testament stuff. There are Christians in this day and age that would say, "Oh, we don't need the Old Testament anymore. We're not under law, we're under grace," and all that kind of chat. And but as you see there in verse 6 and in verse 11, it says, "Now these things became our examples." Okay, so these things were written for our benefit,
Hey, we can just out there.
Yep.
You're addressing things some people maybe would be like, that it's not an excuse, but it's just the old covenant was replaced with the new covenant.
Yeah.
It's the law that we're living under them.
Yeah, which is true, but it doesn't. The sacrificial system of the Old Testament has been fulfilled by Christ. if you look at every sacrifice and what was done and how Christ fulfilled that, we don't need to sacrifice animals. We don't need to give, offerings of meal offerings and, various sorts of things, because half the law was nearly all about that. But the other part of the law that had to do with, as I would call it, the social system, a lot of that is still in force, so it's how to deal with your neighbor, so now some people would pick bits, they sort of cherry pick bits and pieces, now you then have to, as Peter was confronted by the sheet that came down out of heaven with all the creepy crawlies on it, and Peter says, Lord, I won't eat any of these things, they're unclean. But then God was saying, don't call what's unclean clean that I've made clean, So there are things where God says, look, there are then certain, now it was a spiritual explanation using a physical thing. But, basically it was making a statement about, look, right now it doesn't matter, about unclean things. So, in terms of animals and that kind of stuff, go ahead and, eat something that's, that was forbidden at one particular stage. Now, I would say there were lots of pragmatic reasons why, pigs weren't eaten back in those days, even though what were they? They had a cloven hoof, but they didn't chew the cud, so they were labeled as an unclean animal. Pork was the problem back then. Was porks were riddled with tapeworm. And if you ate pork and you didn't cook it to death, you very likely could get tapeworm. Yes, they ate it. Yeah, they were very scavenger sort of critters, So yeah.
Sweat, the stars, so all the dirt comes back into it. You shouldn't really eat pork.
Well, yeah, probably in a lot of ways you shouldn't, So it's the same. And it's the same with shellfish and stuff like this. Shellfish was off the menu, and that was basically because they were bottom feeders and scavengers. It was the same with likes of catfish. Catfish don't have scales. They were regarded as an unclean fish because a clean fish had scales and all this kind of stuff. Catfish didn't, but they were bottom feeders. And ate whatever.
Say in the Bible, or did I put this in the Bible in my head, that prawns or vermin of the sea? That must have been Bible. That's a major Siobhan interpretation there. So yeah, or perspiration or something. I don't know. So anyway, right? Okay. So what we're going to look at here is what Paul is then highlighting with all. Okay. So again, you're looking at sort of repetition of words here. So he's looking back at history, and he says, I don't want you to be unaware that all our fathers were, they were all under the cloud. They all passed through the sea. They all baptized into Moses. They all ate the same spiritual food, and they all drank the same spiritual drink. So all the Jews were all exposed, to the same thing. Okay. Now, what it comes down to is their response then to that, which is what you end up with here, which is most of them, God was not well pleased. Do not become idolaters, as were some of them. Some of them did. Some of them also tempted, and some of them complained. So it wasn't everybody. Okay, but everybody had the same opportunity. Everybody was given the same word. Everybody was given the same revelation of God in terms of Old Testament things. So now he is looking at Jewish history here. So I would say that a lot of the Corinthian believers, who came to faith in Christ, probably don't know a lot of this because they're not familiar with the Old Testament, really. So because a couple of weeks ago they were up in Aphrodite's temple, having a hoo-ha,
So Paul is writing these things because, look, it is very, very important that you understand God's history and the history of God's people. So, right. So then there's these dangers of temptation, which is what Paul is then highlighting in that second paragraph. Okay, so let's look at some things here. So the Old Testament and the understanding of it is very important. So really, when you take Genesis in particular, Genesis talks about the fall of man, where sin came from, and why we need to be redeemed. See, if you take those first couple of chapters of the Old Testament and you scrap them or say that's not important, you'll not know why you need saved. You'll just kind of look at the earth and go, oh yeah, I guess it's a bit of a mess, but according to who? So it is amazing just to hear, like on the radio and recent weather about things with the Pride Parade and all that kind of stuff. Just how many people are they have a conclusion about how certain things are supposed to take place. Well, it's my life, it's my thing. I'll believe what I want because it suits me. It's all situational and relative. So and that's how the devil wants to promote instability. It's like, oh well, sure, whatever you want to believe is okay. So and then it doesn't matter. And so the devil then has everybody in a big fat mist and a set of confusion, and everybody can go to hell in a handbasket. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So it's and it's a bit like sort of watching box sets of various things. If we watch different programs, well, you have to watch the first couple to get all the characters right, otherwise you don't really know what's going on. But anyway, that's that's why when I do these studies, I tend to go backward and forward between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Like I've done Psalms, I did the Kings, and Chronicles and all that stuff. I've done lots of stuff in the New Testament, but I tend to go backward and forward. And the reason for that is so that you understand the Old Testament. Now, there are things in the Old Testament, granted, that are very, very difficult to understand. When you look at some of the stuff out of Jeremiah or Ezekiel in particular, that's like a real headbender there. So, so understand the Old Testament is an important thing to do. So, and the events of the Old Testament are for our example, as it says in verses 6 and 7. So it's for an example, and it is for our admonition. Meaning that it's for our encouragement and for our instruction. And so I think what Paul is doing is he's giving a good example of how to utilize these things, because he's highlighting 4 different stories. He's highlighting people that were idolaters, those that were involved in sexual immorality. Now, why is he highlighting these things? Well, that's what the Corinthians were involved in. So the Corinthians were involved in idolatry. They were involved in sexual immorality. And they need to be shown that, you see, even if you're in God's camp, see, if you do these things, there's repercussions, there's consequences. So what did I write there? What did they all? Okay, well, yes, that's a question. yeah. What did they all experience? So they experienced being under the cloud. Okay, they all experienced being under the cloud. Now, what does that mean? So what that means is they experienced the presence and the protection of God. Okay, because if you remember the stories about the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, the pillar of cloud was really to demonstrate the presence of God, because where the pillar of cloud emanated from was from the tabernacle of meeting, was from the tent. Okay, so if the cloud then moved, which was the presence of God, it was the glory of God, then everybody packed up and went wherever the cloud went, so, but there tended to be not only the pillar of cloud, but there was almost like a dome. There was there was an obvious presence of God that was around the entirety of the camp. So it wasn't just a column of smoke or something like this. It was, the cloud was a thing that God really demonstrated his presence and his protection. Well, maybe, maybe something of that nature. Yeah. So, and then they all passed through the sea. Now that is a direct reference to the Israelites then coming out of Egypt, passing through the Red Sea. Okay, so they all passed through the sea. What's that a representation of? It's the evidence of the power of God, because man didn't open up that way. God, as it says in the Bible, caused an east wind to come and basically just carve the whole thing out. So, and the distance of the Red Sea, like I've talked about before, is like the distance from Ballycastle to Rathlin Island. That was the distance. So it's about 3 or 4 miles across the water. That's what was carved out. Man can't do that. So, God.
What roughly was, how wide was that?
From about Ballycastle to Rathlin Island.
And what would that be, sort of roughly miles?
About 3 or 4 miles.
3 or 4 miles.
Yeah. So, where, if you look in your Bible maps as to where traditionally where the Red Sea crossing was, actually it doesn't make an awful lot of sense. Where archaeologically, I think where the Red Sea crossing was on the Gulf of Aqaba, which was between Saudi Arabia and the Sinai Peninsula. Anyway, so
I always remember you said that the Sea of Galilee was the same size as Loch Ness.
Yeah. Yeah. So not quite the same shape, but sort of you could take the Sea of Galilee and set it, very tightly into Loch Ness quite easily. Yeah.
There's somebody who were the Bible maps the Sinai Peninsula was even more pointing out where the was.
Yep.
And yet Galatians 4 it says that
it's in Galatians. It says it was in Arabia. Yeah. So, and that particular mountain, as found by Ron Wyatt, who was the archaeologist from the 1970s and 80s and such, he went there and found this mountain called what the Saudis call Jabez Laws, and he found all manner of evidence there of an encampment of the Jews. Now, yeah, and that's all cordoned off now. The Saudis will not let anybody go there. So, yeah. Now they were all. That's right. Yes, it was burned.
It's this black rock that they discovered. It wasn't that the rock underneath was like all the rest of the rock that was done by some sort of heat.
Yes, well, and there was also the rock that was split, and there's all evidence of water that came out from under this rock. And this is up high in the mountain. So anyway. So they were all baptized into Moses, which is a reference to the authority of God via the law. Okay, so Moses went to the mountain, received the 10 commandments, brought it down to the people. That's why it's called the law of Moses, but really at the end of the day, it's the law of God. But they were, when we think about baptism, often we think about water, but it's baptism is the idea of being immersed. Okay, so they were immersed into the law of God, and so they were soaked in it, as it were. So when you read Exodus about the giving of the 10 commandments, you read Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law, because the next generation needed to have it re-given. But it was, basically, everybody got it. Everybody was taught it and it was there for everyone.
The picture of the baptism was then flowing through the water, wasn't it?
Well, it wasn't so much going through the Red Sea. I think this particular reference is talking about being immersed in the law. Okay, so yes, yeah, that's how to love God and love your neighbor. Yeah. So and they ate the same spiritual food, which has to do with spiritual nourishment, and so now it's a reference to physical things as well, about the manna that came from where? Heaven. All right, came out of the sky. It was different. It was not grown. It was not something that was the production of man. It came from God. So, and it worked, all the way up until they took up the crops of the promised land, and that's when the manna then stopped in the early part of Joshua. And then they drank the same spiritual drink, and that has to do with spiritual refreshment. Now, because they were in a desert environment, again, it had to be supernaturally produced. So God then instructed Moses, strike that rock, initially. Now, later on, God told him to speak to the rock, and then he was frustrated and he whacked it, which he wasn't supposed to do, and that was bad crack for Moses, because then he was not allowed to go into the promised land as a result of that. But that rock gave water, and it was in the middle of the desert, so it was a supernaturally generated thing. So what Paul is doing here is he's demonstrating, using Old Testament language. Look, God provides. God provides presence and protection. He provides the evidence of his power. He provides authority. He provides nourishment. He provides refreshment.
I think, Woody, it's a lovely, when it talks about the manna, they only got the manna that day for that day.
Yes.
They didn't get it for the next day.
Yeah.
And that speaks to me, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will worry.
Yeah. Except on Friday, they got 2 days worth. Yeah, because of the Sabbath.
Yeah. They had to make it on the one day when the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of like when you go to the chemist. You get the if you're on a daily script, for Sunday you get 2 days worth on a Saturday. That's maybe a bad example, but yeah. Well, yes, it went bad. Yeah. So now it does say that the rock was Christ. It talks about how the rock followed them, but again, it's a spiritual application of a physical thing. The rock didn't move, but God always provided the water, as it were, in terms of where it flowed and how it flowed.
Quail.
Yes. Now the quail was actually. God's perfect plan was to provide manna, and the people needed to be satisfied with the manna. But then they were gurning. They were going, we want meat. And so God, you want meat? Okay, I'll send you a bunch of birds, boys, and you will have more birds, and you can shake a stick at it. In fact, it'll be flipping coming out of your nose. So what manna was? As the Bible describes it, what tasted like coriander and honey, and it was a bit wafery like. Yeah. So it does give
had every nutrient in it.
Yes. Yeah. It was all of what you needed, but the fulfillment of that is where Christ says, "I am the bread that comes out of heaven." So all this parallelism and reference to
like in bread form. Would have been in bread form.
Well, not like a loaf of bread like we would understand loaf of bread.
Like yeast.
Well, yeah, it came on the ground, and you collected it,
and you could use it and make cakes with
Right.
it. You could bake it, you could boil it, you could cook it, you could, I don't know.
Oh,
You could probably, yeah. Now, I think it in and of itself, I'm sure that you could grab a handful and throw it in your mouth and it would be fine.
Right.
You know.
Captain says if you didn't use it all,
Yeah.
try to eat something tomorrow.
Yeah, it'll go bad. Yeah. So anyway, this is what they all experienced. Okay. So again, what Paul is doing is he's going into the Old Testament and saying, look, this is what the Old Testament demonstrates about the character of God and what God does and how God provides. Now, this is where man then goes and makes a choice about this. Am I going to trust God who provides all these things for me, or am I going to go and punch holes in it and cherry pick it and take what suits me, and whatever doesn't suit me, I'll throw wobbly. And so this is what happens. Okay, so then there was the examples of then the some of them. Okay, so there was the idolatry. So that's a reference to Exodus 32:4 and verse 4 and verse 6. And it says, and he received gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf. And then they said, this is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. This is talking about the golden calf that Aaron had made. Basically, he had gotten all the jewelry from everybody, that was gold jewelry. That's boil it down, that's melt it down. And so it says there that, he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a golden calf. Now, when he was challenged by Moses about that, he said, the people just kind of gave it to me. And, hey, I popped a calf, whoa, what happened there, And and then it says, then they rose early, and the next day they offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings to the golden calf. And the people sat down, ate, drank, and rose up to play. Now, when it says play there, different people interpret that different ways, but basically, at the very least, they got up and danced. At the very worst, they got up and had sex. Okay, so that's what they were doing. It's amazing how quickly these people, seeing all this from God, all this supernatural stuff that comes from God, and then they go, where's Moses?
But they've done that the whole 40 years in the desert.
That's right. So anyway.
I remember you were passing through the Red Sea with all this water and then they're saying,
yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So this is what the reference is in terms of idolatry. So this feeds into the idolatrous thinking that the Corinthians would have. They would look at their own idolatry, which they did with Aphrodite and all that, and Zeus and whatever else was going on, and then they would go, this is not too far different than what we're doing, and there's consequences for that. So we better keep ourselves straight. Now, the next thing was sexual immorality. So this was Numbers 25. And it says, now Israel remained in the acacia grove, and people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab, and they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. And so Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. And then the Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and hang the offenders before the Lord out in the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel. And so Moses said to the judges of Israel, every one of you kill his men who were joined to Baal of Peor. And indeed, one of the children of Israel came and presented to his brethren a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping at the door of the tabernacle meeting. And now when Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw it, he arose from among the congregation
and took a javelin in his hand, and he went after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through, and the man of Israel and the woman through her body. So the plague was stopped among the children of Israel, and those who died in the plague were 24,000. Now, one question that immediately pops up. How many people did Paul quote in terms of how many people died?
24,000.
Nope. 23,000. Now here it says 24,000. Now, critics of the Bible would, jump up and down, and they would go, see, discrepancies in the Bible. Somebody's not getting it right here, so therefore it can't be trusted. Now, what Paul says is 23,000 died in one day. 24,000 died in the whole exercise.
It may have been the next day or.
Yeah. So it's okay, because you just have to look at the detail, So some people would. I was thinking about our Civil War, and Sam would appreciate this since you've seen a lot of the battlefields over in America. But can you tell me what was the worst one day casualty battle? Antietam. Yeah. So there was 33,000 men, 33,000 casualties that one day in Antietam. Now, that was not the worst battle, though. The worst battle was Gettysburg. 55,000 men died in a 3-day battle. Okay, so it does depend on sort of how you look at numbers, and you can play about with numbers, but
that must have been an awful place.
Yeah.
They must have been just sleeping with anybody. It must have been wild.
Oh yeah. Now the man that incited this was Balaam. Okay. Now, does everybody know the story about Balaam and the donkey and all that crack? Okay. Now, what happened with Balaam? Balaam was a prophet for hire. So kings, different nobility would go and get Balaam, say, look, we'll give you a lot of quid. And if you curse our enemies, we'll give you a lot of money and all this sort of stuff. So what was it, the Amalekite king? Anyway, his name was Balak. Okay. Balak goes 500 miles to the east over into Babylon and finds Balaam and says, look, we're going to hire you and we want you to come and curse Israel. And now Balaam was told by God, don't be going with these people because I've blessed them. You can't bless what God, has, so yeah, you can't curse what God's blessed, So he tells the men, look, I'm not coming with you. So he sends more notable sort of guys, okay, to go and hire him. And so I think then Balaam is very attracted by the money. And so he then goes. And so he's on his donkey and he's riding along, and then the donkey sees the angel, and then the donkey lies down because he doesn't want to confront the angel. But Balaam, because he's so fixated on this money and all that kind of stuff, can't see the angel in front of him. So he starts beating his donkey and telling the donkey to get up, and then the angel's moving around to block him. And then the donkey talks to him and says, haven't I been your donkey and faithful to you for a lot of years, and you're beating me? Look, what's up ahead of you? So anyway, then God speaks to Balaam and he says, look, you go ahead with these men, but I'm going to tell you what to say. So there's 4 occasions where Balak says, right, I'm going to take you, Balaam, and I'm going to put you so that you can see a certain aspect of Israel, and you curse them. And then Balaam goes, does the attempt to do the cursing thing, but God then puts a word into his mouth and it turns into a blessing. So it happens 4 times. And
So, and those all represent different things, represents God's forgiveness and God's view on people and so on and so forth. But Balaam ends up being this really dangerous character because he doesn't pack up and go home. He doesn't learn that God is in charge of him, even though he controlled what he said. He's going, I'm still going to go and screw them, So so Balaam then goes and does this, and he incites the Israelites to go and commit harlotry with the women of Moab. So, and then they all get paired up with Baal of Beor, which is one of the many Baals. Okay, so there wasn't just one Baal; there was a bunch of Baals. So and Baal was the kind of the male side of the Ashtaroth, which was the kind of the female fertility goddess, and and they all got on like a house on fire.
It all started with in Tower Babel, and that's where what do you call it?
Nimrod.
That's where all that BL all started from.
Probably, yes, probably, yeah. So. Yeah, he reads too. So he's a
Numbers chapter 23 and 24.
Yeah.
You'll find the story.
He's a brain surgeon and a night job.
Keep saying that, it's there.
Yeah.
I never understand that they leave that.
Yeah.
So
So
it's just a story of the past.
yeah,
It doesn't say you to read the Bible, that will make you wait to study.
yeah.
And if
So
I could study that all day, it's not like.
No,
Well,
it's not passages.
one of these days, maybe we'll go back to Balaam and look at all those different blessings that came, because there's wonderful teaching out of that. So, but so anyway, but again, what Paul is doing is he's now highlighting something again about the Corinthians that is quite endemic to them, which is sexual immorality. So he's saying, look at the Old Testament here. See what the people of God did. They were given the law, they were given everything that they needed, and then they go and they make a bad choice, and then bad things happen. So, right. Now, then there was the tempting or testing of Christ, as it puts it. Now, obviously, Christ was not mentioned as such in Old Testament terms, but what Paul is doing is he's applying New Testament understanding to Old Testament things. So in Exodus 17, verse 2, it says, therefore the people contended with Moses and says, give us water that we may drink. And so Moses said to him, why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord? Now this is where they were initially. Now this is not too long after the Exodus, when they actually got out of the other side of the Red Sea here. So water was an issue. So, but they have to. What the people had to learn was that they had to trust God for everything. Not trust their own mechanisms, not trust their own intuition, and use divining rods and stuff like this to go and find water. They had that situation in Mara where the water was bitter. And so, and what Moses said to God, this water is bitter. What do we, at least there was the conversation with God. Then God tells them what to do. Take that tree, fell it into the water, and then it will make the water sweet. That's exactly what happened. And then after that, they went to Elim. Okay, not the Elim church, but okay. But that's where the Elim church gets their name. But they went to a place called Elim, which had a load of palm trees and all kinds of water, and it was really nice. So it was a place where you can sort of put the feet up. Now in Numbers 21, because there is a reference to the serpents in this particular verse in 1 Corinthians,
it says, so the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. And therefore the people came to Moses and says, we have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he might take away the serpents from us. And so Moses prayed for the people, and then the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and it shall be that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, shall live. And so Moses made a bronze serpent, put it on a pole, and so it was that the serpent had bitten anyone. Then he looked at when he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. So now I am sure that not only did Paul teach about this, but where else is it mentioned about the serpent in the New Testament? John 3. So Jesus would have says, as Moses lifted up the serpent on the pole, even so the Son of Man must be lifted up. Okay, and that
Look to Christ and live.
look to Christ and live. So Paul would have been teaching this. So Paul would have been very, very adept. I would have loved being under Paul's teaching, because he would have been marrying up Old Testament and New Testament things constantly. Says, here's Old Testament stuff, and this is how it's fulfilled. This is how Jesus dealt with it and talked about it, and it, it all comes together.
Paul's teaching is Pauline, isn't it?
Pauline, yeah. So yeah. So trying to think of what Peter.
No, it might be that.
So anyway, but can you see how important the Old Testament is? So because there was a lot of testing, going on, people being kind of torn asunder. Here I'm going into the church and I'm being told these things, but that goes against my grain of how I was brought up.
Paul describes it to you. It brings the New Testament life.
Yes, sure. Yeah. So there was a man that was in our assembly back home who was a converted Jew. And when he taught on the book of Hebrews, you just were like, where did that come from? It was just absolutely, because he had such a deep understanding of Israelite history, and application of all that stuff. So far we've dealt with three things. There's idolatry, there's sexual immorality, and there's this tempting thing, which then Paul will then talk about a little later. Then there are the people who were complaining. Okay, and in Exodus 16:2, it says, then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And so then in Numbers 14, verse 37, it says, those very men who brought the evil report about the land, these are the men that went in as spies, and then they came back and says, we can't take the land because there's too many flaming giants there, and there's huge people and they're everywhere. And that really wasn't the truth. There was some giants, but they weren't everywhere. But sometimes that's what happens in our life. We go, this one little thing tends to be everywhere. So they brought the evil report, and but then they died by plague before the Lord. So anyway, so there's all these examples, and now I would say that there's probably loads of others that have to do with complaining and testing God and all that kind of stuff. So these are just ones that if you look in a study Bible and you look at the cross reference, that's the stuff that's sort of highlighted there. So that's one way you study. Is you get a Bible that has a middle column that has cross references in it, and you look at the little letter or number or whatever is inside the verse. Tends to be like a little superscript thing, very tiny, and you marry up that letter. It might be like the letter S or T or something like this, and then you go and you look in the middle column and line it up with your verse, and then you go, oh, there's the S, and then there's that verse, and then you can go into the Old Testament, look it up. Now, if you have a fancy Bible program, all you have to do is move your mouse and highlight the letter and click on it and blink, so there it is.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, this is if you have a study Bible. Anyway,
I saw a thing on YouTube last week, but I don't know whether I get it or not, because in case it's not right, it's to study the Old Testament in picture form. Because this girl said that she only learned by seeing things, seeing pictures.
Yeah.
But then what if you get that and that's not right, it's not right?
well, what I would do if because there is a lot of that kind of stuff that pops up, and I found that like on Instagram, I would go and watch Helene's little stuff on Instagram, but because you use your phone to go and look at certain things, a lot of ads for various things pop up. And so because I look at Bible things, there's a lot of Bible ads that pop up, and people pitching all their various Bible study flips and whatever. I think what you then do is you go, okay, if I'm interested in that, go to their website, look at their statement of faith, look at what they believe. If there's some weird marginal kind of off the beaten track crowd that believes funny stuff, well, then no, I won't bother.
Another thing that I would do too would be read the youngsters' storybooks.
Yeah.
Bible storybooks.
Yeah.
And that gives you sometimes the better, it gives you like
it gives you a simplified version sometimes. I find with children's stories, yes, go ahead and read that, but make sure you read the big people version too, because sometimes what the kiddie stuff will do is they'll extract certain bits and pieces, sometimes at the expense of what's important.
It gives you the gist.
It can, yeah.
There's a Bible called the Chronological Bible. Our Bible isn't chronological order. But almost like a history book. And it's an eye opener when you read it. Suddenly, stuff that you didn't understand before just makes sense to you because you're doing it in chronological order, sequence of events. And it's very easy, the one side, the best one out there is not the New Living Testament.
Yeah.
Easy to read.
No, if a wave at it stops it.
It's the New Living, it's the chronological Bible. It's by Sam.
Was it Holman or?
No, it's not.
What's Thunder?
It's one of the more famous ones. That's not that. No, it's not that.
You said New Living Testament.
Tyndale.
New Living Testament.
No,
No,
yes,
no,
it is the New Living Translation.
NLT.
Yeah.
NLT. And it's a study Bible too. You'll get them, and you'll get it down in the bookshop down. It's a superb too. By Tyndale, that's like Tyndale.
Dale, D-A-L-E, Tyndale, yeah. Okay, now.
You don't find a tattered one. I have a tattered one which I haven't used.
Well, I would love it. Thank you.
Okay, I can have a tattered one. Okay, let's talk about dealing with temptation then, because because with idolatry, with sexual immorality, tempting or testing and complaining, would you not agree that it's tempting for those people of that day and age, at the very least, to go and continue on with them things? So, so this is where Paul then, focuses down and looks at temptation in particular.
Just
So,
don't seem to be satisfied.
yeah.
What God can give.
Yes, and I think that is a big thing, is about satisfaction. Okay, so 1 Corinthians 10:12-13 says this. It says, therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you might be able to bear it. So I would say if you're looking for a verse to memorize this. This is extremely important for practice that will work. Okay. So Now we'll visit this kind of piece by piece because there's quite a lot that's going on here. This would be a scripture that I would sit down with a lot of my men that I'm sitting with and working with, because they're struggling with temptation. There's loads of temptation to go back to drink. There is temptation to go back to a bad relationship. There is temptation to go back to the bar or go back to some kind of old life thing. Yeah. So because you see, old sins are cheap and nasty and quick and dirty. So they hit the right button sometimes. So but what the devil does is it doctors it up and makes it all look good and see, well, sure, that's what go back to it dead on, and then you immerse yourself into them things, and then the devil goes whee, and flies away, and then you're standing there with all your guilt. And then you don't want to be seen by man or beast, so. All right. So let's look at this for a second here. So the first thing is, remember that temptation is not a sin. It depends on what you do with it. Okay. So because the Lord Jesus Christ was tempted. All right. So if temptation in and of itself was sin, then Christ sinned. So that's not true. So it depends on what you do with it. Everybody is faced up with all sorts of things. So I think that's important to set out straight away. Now, where it says there in verse 12, about and let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. So basically, don't be cocky and don't be self-assured here. Be humble. Because I remember early on in my Christian career, one time, as a kind of a early teenager, and really getting into the scriptures, really getting into the things of God, and boy, this is great. Being in a youth group, and there's, it was all good, and then the devil comes along and really makes this look really good, and he says, boy, isn't this brilliant? You don't have any desire for sin anymore. Isn't that great? And then you're going, yeah, boy, super. Wonderful, that's great. So then the devil starts to move you just at the edge of the cliff, and then he then goes, and kicks you down the cliff, and because you think you're then standing, and then you fall.
And there's another one, isn't there? He exalts himself and be humbled.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
And he who humbles himself will be exalted, So and it says, humble yourself before the Lord and he'll lift you up, So it's a lot better to be exalted by God than it is to be exalted by man, So yeah, yes, absolutely, So and you've probably heard the proverbial story where congregation gave a medal to the pastor for being a humble man. And then when he put it on, they took it away from him. So anyway. Yeah. So sold 1 million copies, So look at me. So but yeah, it's a very, very edgy sort of part of the world to be in. So now the other thing is where it says no temptation has overtaken you, but such is common to man. So you are not isolated, okay? At least one other person in the world has experienced this temptation, so therefore you cannot say, no one understands me. Now, I deal with this constantly because I have people that sit with me and they say, I bet you've never dealt with anybody like me before. And in weird kind of ways, they want to sort of isolate themselves to make themselves look like they can't, they can't be helped, and they're almost like special in it. Yeah, special case, and it's like, yeah, look at me, I'm really screwed up. Yeah, oh, good. Happy days. Yeah. So anyway, but what this demonstrates is that there is at least one person, because it's common. It's common to man. Temptation is common to man. So, and guess what? It's common to Jesus. Because as it says in Hebrews 4, that we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but was tempted in every way as we are, and yet without sin. So, yes.
What's the definition of temptation? I know it seems like too simple a question, but I think it's easy to get wrong.
Well, I think, temptation is anything that an outside agent or somebody, or like yourself, can be lured to do that will bring about destruction, whether it is destruction of mind or destruction of body.
You could tempt yourself, couldn't you, with your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, because where temptation really at the end of the day is where you decide about that is you. All right. Because if the devil could legitimately be blamed for what we do, then we could say it was him. He made me do it. And we hear this a lot in society, where the devil made me do it. No, the devil can't make you do squat. The devil cannot make you do anything. Yeah. So it's but what the devil does is he exacerbates that and exploits it and pushes certain buttons in order to hopefully get us to go and do a wrong thing. But
over being tempted, because as you say, it's not a sin, but it depends what you do with it.
Yeah.
In front of you, and then you
Maybe in fight a little more.
Yeah. So I think this is an important thing to understand, because I think the reason Paul's doing this is that there is a collection of people within the church that have experienced very similar things. And so there are Christians that are mature, that have gone down these roads, and they're saying, look, we understand this. We can support you through this. I find it really hard to swallow sometimes, when Christians get on their high horse, and they go and they look at people that are weak and tempted and all that. I'll look at you, see what you're doing. That's terrible. And being all smug. Well, the man thinks he stands, doesn't take heed lest he fall,
My mom used to say, "It's a long road, no turn."
Yeah.
You don't know what's going on.
Yeah. So that's why it's about, don't be cocky, don't be self-assured. You need to be humble. Right. Okay. God is always faithful, even in the midst of temptation. That's a very important caveat to understand. That, because again, what the devil would want to say is, oh, you're being tempted. God's left you. You shouldn't be thinking like this. That's bad. No, but God is faithful. God, so God, even in the midst of this, is there, because actually He'll use it. See, what a temptation is what the devil would seek to use to tear you down. Now, you can fling this around to be a test, which is a thing that God can use to build you up.
If you're living really close to the Lord, the temptations are more, I think. Sure,
absolutely. Because when you think about Jesus Christ, who lived extremely close to God, okay, inextricably so, but yet it says he was tempted in every way as we were. So every bad, evil thought that any of us have ever had in this room, of which we've all had, Christ has experienced the temptation of all those times 1,000. So, Christ, has been tempted in more ways than we can even appreciate.
I think, the closer you are to the Lord, even a temptation gives you a real bad conviction.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a fiery dart.
Yeah.
Even to think of something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and so when we're living close to God, then we do there's the difference between guilt and conviction, because again, what the devil uses, he uses guilt, and he says, right, this is how you can manage your past. I'll drop you in a big fat cave, and then you can go and wallow in it, and there's no way out. That's what guilt does. Now, conviction, on the other hand, is something that the Spirit does, which he says, yes, you've done wrong, but there's a way out. There's a way forward. I can cleanse your conscience. I can forgive your sin. I can actually help you to go forward. So because the devil doesn't want us to move forward. He does not want us to mature. He does not want us to, if anything, with the people of God, he wants the people of God to get stuck, and be unproductive. Because when we're unproductive and we're just wallowing around in our own little misery, then we're not reaching kids for Christ. We're not being an example to our family who are unsaved or any of that kind of stuff, because we're all moaning and going and, complaining. And, that's, Paul was highlighting that. Yeah. So, all self-pity and all that stuff. So God puts limitations on temptation, understanding your ability to cope. Now, that's a great promise. Now, this is written to Christians, okay? This is not written to the unsaved, because when the unsaved is tempted, all bets are off, and you could be going down some bad road. But there is something like, and Paul was demonstrating this earlier in the chapter, saying, God, the pillar, all were in the cloud, all were passed through the sea, and all these different. So, they understood the presence of God and the protection of God. So in the midst of temptation as a believer, you're protected by God. Now, you still have a choice whether you're going to go down this bad road or not, but God will put a leash on it and say, I'm not going to let you be tempted beyond what you can cope with.
But then would you have to watch where we go if you keep coming?
Oh, well, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Because, we could choose and say, well, God, I know better. I'm going to do my own thing. And then that takes you down. And God's going, what? But I'm giving you an opportunity to get this right.
But the girl once asked me when I was in Windsor working, and she said, reality here. When I talked to her, I said, go ahead. She said, look, my daughter, she's Christian, she says she's a Christian, but she's going to coach on a Saturday night. Mm-hmm. She's not drinking now, but she's with her friends. I said, well, you need to get her out of there, because it's only a matter of time before she does take a drink. Yeah. But she's there.
Yeah, yes, yeah, and if you continue to avail yourself to wrong thinking and wrong behavior and all that stuff, you will then end up in the wrong place. So but if you're tempted by those things, God does give you ability to deal with it.
I was having a conversation last week with a girl, and she said that she believed that that the devil, the way the devil talked to God about Job, and said, I'm going to tempt him and I'm going to do all this. She believed that the Lord does that with us all. I'm going to, like, for example, say, I'm going to do something to Woody and see what, but he doesn't do that with everybody.
Well, you have to read Job closely, because Satan was going to and fro throughout the whole earth, and just seeing this, that, and the other thing, and then God is the one that brings Job up. And so he says, have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him. He's righteous, he's good, and all this kind of stuff. And then Satan goes, the only reason he's like this because you bless the socks off him. You take away, if you do something, you take away things, he'll curse you. So God, God wasn't the instigator of, well, he brought Job in the framework.
Yes.
But he gave the devil the license to go and do certain things, but
not kill him.
Yeah, that's right. So God was in complete control of what could happen or not happen with Job.
I think what she meant was, you know, if something bad happens in your life, that the devil, that comes from the devil, but God allows it.
Well, again, I think what it boils down to is this, are you being tempted or are you being tested thing? Because the devil would want you to be tempted in order to tear you down. Or God will take the same thing and use it as a test to build you up. So it just depends on what you do with it. So, you know, there's people that have, you know, I talked with this to a guy there the other day about, you know, all of us are dealt a certain hand, as it were. You know, some of us have a worse hand than others.
Yeah.
Now, you know, and some people get envious of other people, you know, and other, you know, Christians go, gosh, you have it good. My family is all up the left and they're bad and we have health problems and everybody's falling out with each other. What's wrong with me? Well, there may not be anything wrong with you, actually. It's just how that is. Now, God's in charge of that. Why that is, I don't know. But you know what God wants us to do is say, you need to trust me through this.
But everything that you're saying about God allows, that everything that happens, God allows it.
But what she
Just that
meant,
he doesn't step into something.
but what she meant, Kevin, was that the devil talks to God and says, right,
The guy who does this one today.
exactly. And I don't think that happens.
I think what happens to us is from the devil. It's bad. It's from the devil. Every good and perfect gift comes down from God, and everything that's not coming from the devil.
But God allows it.
Yes.
Stop it.
Because we have a free will, you not stop it.
What God chooses
No,
not
but
to
say
get involved in it.
if you took sick,
But that's part of your human nature. That's
Yes, but well, I think what she meant was, you know, well, God could stop you from being sick.
yes.
Yeah.
What is the reason that you're sick in the first place?
Sin.
It's not God.
Yes, that's true. But we have to live within the framework of the sovereignty of God, which is that, you know, and now we throw this verse around a fair bit, but, you know, God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and those who are called according to his purpose, you know, so that's a great verse about the sovereignty of God. You know, you look in Proverbs 16:9, where it says the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps.
I think there's just some things we'll never understand.
No, and we won't understand it on this side of heaven, you know, and I think even when we get to heaven, you know, God's going to take eternity to explain it to us and we'll be going, say that again, you know, so, anyway, lastly, in the midst of temptation, we'll highlight ways of escape so that you can bear it. Now that's a great thing too, because, you know, I think it's good to sit down with oneself and assess things and say, Lord, help me to understand, you know, what I'm being tempted with. And because of your promise that you say, you know, that, I'll be able to cope with it, but you also say that I'll have a way of escape. So help me to identify what those ways of escape are. God will always give you a way of escape. You know, God will not give you some sort of temptation that you will not be able to negotiate out of. So, so that takes work. You know, it takes maturity. You know, and it, you know, and it takes, you know, other believers with other believers to help them with these things. You know,
need like we call that real strong obedience and. That self-control is a big thing.
Yeah. So
that's a gift of the Holy Spirit.
Yes, and that is something that is developed and grown by God, you know, and self, you know, when it talks about the fruit of the Spirit, you know, the fruit is something that doesn't just pop up overnight, you know, it is something that grows. So you know, it starts out small and gets bigger.
There are Christians who get into the terrible pucker about, you know, what you're saying there, where God could have stopped that and didn't.
Yes.
God, you tried to drive up the road and you wreck it.
Yes.
Why did God allow that to happen?
Yes.
But
look at
the things happen to Paul in his life.
Because if God did interfere in everything, the first thing you would do would be complaining about he's making me do things that I don't want to do, and then free will goes out of it. And
that's right.
we become robots. And
Yeah.
And then sometimes you can get people pointing the finger at you, oh, that's happened because you must have sinned.
Yeah, that's right.
You can get that too.
That's right.
And you can just try and accept things as it is and trust God to get you to it.
Yeah,
And then you have ones that says that happened because you don't stop.
Yeah.
yeah.
And you